Chapter 1. Altered Circumstances. The Dashwood family had lived for many generations in Sussex. Their estate at Norland Park was large, and they were a respectable family, liked by their neighbours and esteemed by their servants. Mr. Henry Dashwood, the present owner of the elegant old manor house, had inherited the property from his uncle. He had one son by his first marriage, and by his second wife, 3 daughters. The son was well provided for financially by the fortune of his late mother, and by his own marriage to a wealthy lady. But Mr. Dashwood's daughter's future was less secure. The father knew that when he died, the estate had to be left to his son, for these were the conditions of the inheritance imposed by his uncle, and he was worried about his dear daughters. He therefore made his son John promise that when his father died, he would look after his half-sisters and make sure that they had everything they needed to live comfortably. Soon after this, Mr. Dashwood became ill, and within a year had passed away. John Dashwood remembered his solemn promise and decided to give his sisters £1,000 each from his considerable inheritance. John Dashwood was a steady, respectable young man, but rather selfish and cold. Perhaps if he had married a more affectionate and amiable woman, he would have become more generous. But in fact, he had married a woman even more narrow-minded and selfish than himself. Mrs. Fanny Dashwood did not like her husband's half-sisters or his stepmother. She was jealous of their strong affection for one another and their influence over her husband. When he explained his intentions to help the girls to his wife, she did not approve at all. She was certain these women were scheming to get some of her husband's money. Therefore, she replied that giving the £3,000 to his sisters would really mean taking the money from their baby son's future inheritance. Did he really believe that the Miss Dashwoods' claim to the money, as half-relations, could possibly be stronger than their dear little boys, their only son, and the apple of their eye? Mr. Dashwood was surprised at this interpretation, but, being rather reluctant to part with his money, quickly began to see the reason in his wife's argument. He therefore decided to reduce the sum to £500 each. He was sure 3 young women would be perfectly comfortable on the interest from such a sum. But Fanny was still not content.
"If the girls marry, they may end up having more money than us," she cried. "Why not do something for their mother instead? A little sum to her will benefit them all. 4 women living together can live very cheaply," she added.
Her husband agreed that she was probably right. A small yearly annuity to his stepmother of £100 would be the answer. His wife agreed, but then pointed out a possible complication. His stepmother was still a strong, healthy woman and might live for another 15 years. That could mean paying £1,500 if they began now. Better to simply give his sisters a little present of £50 now and again, she suggested, and not commit himself to the risk of any permanent arrangement. That would be more than generous. No one could expect him to do more for half-relations. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters remained at Norland for several weeks after her husband's death. They were all very fond of the old place, and leaving it would be difficult. However, when Fanny, with an extreme lack of diplomacy and sympathy for their position, arrived without notice only days after her father-in-law had died, and began to give the servants orders and alter the furniture, her mother-in-law began to see how she would be treated if she remained at Norland. She was therefore impatient to find another house as soon as possible. She started to make inquiries, and luckily a cousin of hers wrote her a very friendly letter, offering them a charming property on his estate in Devonshire for a very reasonable rent. Only one thing now stopped Mrs. Dashwood from leaving Norland immediately. Recently, she had noticed a growing romantic attachment between her eldest daughter, Eleanor, and Fanny's brother, Edward. Edward was the opposite of his sister in every respect. A serious, thoughtful young man, rather shy, but well-educated and sincere. The sensible and even-tempered Eleanor also seemed to like him very much, and, to Mrs. Dashwood's optimistic and romantic nature, their mutual affection looked certain to end in marriage. When Eleanor, in conversation with her impulsive sister Marianne, learned of her mother's hopes, she was very embarrassed, and begged Marianne to convince their mother that their departure for Devonshire should not be delayed for this reason. Edward was sweet and attentive to her, but so far had not mentioned marriage, and she knew that his rich family, in particular his snobbish mother, would disapprove of any connection between their eldest son and a girl of no fortune like herself. Marianne was surprised at Eleanor's calm, practical attitude Chapter 2. A New Home and New Friends. As soon as she had sent her reply to her cousin, Mrs. Dashwood was able to tell her selfish daughter-in-law that she would be leaving Norland as soon as possible for a new home. John Dashwood was very surprised that she had decided on Devonshire, so far from Norland Park. But Mrs. Dashwood's feelings towards him and his wife were so changed recently that she had no inclination to remain near them. Although she cordially invited them to come and visit the cottage whenever they liked, she knew they would never come. She also noticed Fanny's evident annoyance when she extended a warm and more sincere invitation to Edward Ferrars. In spite of the black look she received from her daughter-in-law, however, she was determined that Elinor's chances of happiness would not be spoiled by Edward's family prejudice towards her beloved daughter. The girls and their mother made plans for their new home. Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne were full of ambitious projects for entertaining on a grand scale and extending the house in all directions to accommodate guests. But fortunately, Elinor was more realistic and practical, and eventually persuaded them to accept a more conservative plan, better suited to their reduced circumstances, with only 3 servants and no carriage. While they packed their things, Mrs. Dashwood waited for her stepson to speak out on the delicate matter of her daughter's financial position. She knew he had promised his father to help them, and believed this was the ideal time to make them a settlement. Nothing at all was said on the matter by the new owner of Norland, however, and, apart from some assistance with the transportation of their furniture and boxes, it became obvious that he had no intention of helping them further. Mrs. Dashwood was indignant, but pride and distaste at her stepson's shabby behaviour prevented her from saying anything. However, his behaviour only increased her disappointment in him and her dislike for his wife, and provided another reason for leaving their house as soon as she could. The girls were very sad to leave their beloved Norland Park, and cried many tears when their carriage finally turned west and they left the lovely old house behind them. However, their spirits lifted a few days later when they arrived in Devonshire and saw the pretty valley which was to be their new home. It was a fertile and pleasant spot, with wooded slopes and rich pastures. The situation of the house was good, with high hills behind it and lovely views from the windows over the valley. The cottage itself was small and compact, but well built. For Marianne's romantic tastes, it was rather defective as a cottage because it didn't have a thatched roof, honeysuckle round the door, or green shutters. However, it was certainly comfortable and cosy, and the ladies were generally pleased with it. The next morning, after breakfast, they received their first visit from their relation and new landlord, Sir John Middleton. He was a good-looking gentleman of around 40, friendly and good-humoured. He urged them to accept his invitation to dinner to meet his wife as soon as possible, and assured them that he was delighted to have such a charming family as his new neighbours. The same afternoon his kind words were followed by a generous present of fruit and vegetables from the gardens at the great house, and a basket of game, which he had shot himself, for their table. In fact, from the beginning, their treatment at Barton was so different from what they had received recently at Norland that the girls began to feel happier immediately. They looked forward to meeting Lady Middleton the next day. Barton Park was a large, handsome house where the Middletons lived in a style of elegance and hospitality. Sir John apologized for the small size of their party. He was a fun-loving, sociable man who liked nothing better than to arrange noisy dancing parties, suppers, and picnics for his young friends, and he would have liked to organize a dance in their honor. Elinor, however, assured him that they preferred to be quiet on their first evening, and thanked him for his kind invitation to dinner. Of the guests present at the table, the girls thought Lady Middleton was rather a disappointment. She was certainly elegant and well-bred, but her conversation was dull and insipid, her one interest in life being her noisy, spoiled children, who annoyed the guests all night with their tricks and demands. Elinor privately wondered what Sir John and his lady talked about when they were alone. The husband's only real passion seemed to be hunting, and his wife couldn't even ride. Also present at dinner was Lady Middleton's mother, Mrs. Jennings, a jolly, middle-aged lady whose main occupation in life was to try and make matches for all the young people she knew. She was delighted to meet the pretty Dashwood girls, and began teasing them immediately about the broken-hearted young men she was sure they had left behind them in Sussex. An old friend of Sir John's, Colonel Brandon, completed the group that night. A taciturn, serious man of around 35, he seemed as unsuitable to be Sir John's friend as Lady Middleton seemed to be his wife, and Eleanor was curious about him. He was not handsome, but had a pleasant, intelligent face and a respectful, gentlemanly manner. He didn't say much, but when he spoke, what he said was sensible. His age and quietness had caused Marianne to ignore him almost completely, but later in the evening, when the others found out she was musical and invited her to play, she saw a different side to his character. While the others insisted loudly that she play something, they nevertheless talked continuously throughout her entire performance, then praised her skill without having listened to her. Colonel Brandon, on the other hand, was silent and attentive, and showed a real appreciation of her talent. So, while Marianne was convinced that at his advanced age the Colonel couldn't possibly feel things as acutely and passionately as she did, she had to admit that perhaps when he was younger he had been a man of sensitivity and taste. Chapter 3. Marianne's Rescuer. The Dashwoods were now settled in their new home, and although they didn't have many visitors, the countryside around them offered many beautiful walks, and they spent a lot of time outdoors. One morning, after 2 days of rain had confined them to the house, Marianne and Margaret decided to walk on the nearby hills, hoping that the weather, which was still changeable, would stay fine for their short excursion. It was windy, and the sky was cloudy and sunny by turns, but the fresh air excited the two sisters, who pushed their way against the strong wind, laughing. After about 20 minutes, however, it suddenly began to rain very heavily. They had reached a steep hill above their house, and decided to run down as fast as possible back to the cottage. Marianne was usually faster than Margaret, but now, as she was running, she caught her foot in a hole in the rough ground and fell heavily, twisting her ankle. At that moment, a young gentleman, dressed for shooting, was crossing the hill with his dogs and saw the accident happen. He rushed to help poor Marianne and offered to help her get up. Then, realizing she couldn't move, picked her up in his arms without any embarrassment and carried her like a baby back to the cottage. Eleanor and her mother gasped in amazement when they saw Marianne arrive in the arms of this unknown gentleman. When she heard the story, Mrs. Dashwood was extremely grateful to him for helping her daughter, and was charmed by his courteous manners. He was young, tall and handsome, with thick black hair, well-dressed and, from his way of speaking, obviously a gentleman. She asked him to stay for tea, but he refused, saying he was dirty and wet and must go home. But he asked if he could return the next day to see how the patient was. His name, he told them, was Willoughby, and he was in the area visiting a relative. When he had gone, Marianne's sisters teased her terribly about her gallant rescuer, and although she denied any admiration for him, she had seen enough to know that he was as good-looking and distinguished as any of the heroes in her favourite novels. In fact, her unusual return to the cottage in his arms seemed like an episode straight from one of them. She thought about the gallant stranger all day, and fortunately these pleasant reveries helped her to forget the pain in her ankle. When Sir John arrived later, they told him the story, asked him if he knew Mr. Willoughby, and what his opinion of him was.
"Willoughby? There is not a bolder rider in all of England,"
cried Sir John with enthusiasm.
"Is that all you can tell us?"
replied Marianne, disappointed. He thought for a while, then added that Willoughby was the heir to the nearby Allenham estate, which he would inherit when his old aunt died, and that his own small property was in the county of Somerset.
"But what of his character and tastes?"
demanded Marianne. Sir John, however, was the wrong man to ask such questions. He only remembered that he had once invited Willoughby to a Christmas party at Barton Park, where the young man had danced until 4 o'clock in the morning and then got up to go hunting the next morning at 8.
"That is what I like. That is how a young man should be,"
cried Marianne with admiration. Sir John observed, laughing, that now Miss Dashwood would be setting her cap at the dashing Mr. Willoughby, without a thought for his friend Colonel Brandon, who was rumoured to be completely in love with her, if Mrs. Jennings was to be believed. Marianne hotly replied that she had no intention of doing anything so vulgar, and that the story about the Colonel was pure invention. Willoughby called the next day to see how the patient was, and the day after, and the day after that. He soon became a regular visitor at the cottage. He enjoyed the lively company of the Dashwood girls, which distracted him from the boredom of life with his aunt at Allenham. Eleanor, he observed, was an attractive young woman with wavy brown hair, delicate features and a pretty figure. But Marianne was the real beauty of the family. She was tall, with dark hair, a brilliant complexion, and sparkling black eyes full of vivacity and enthusiasm for life. When they got to know each other better, she and Willoughby soon found they had many tastes and preferences in common. They both loved music and dancing passionately, and often sang together at the piano. Before long, they were treating each other like old friends. Mrs. Dashwood was pleased with the blossoming friendship. Although in the beginning she had not thought of the possibility of a match between the two, as Willoughby's attentions to her daughter became more marked, she began to congratulate herself on her good fortune in having two daughters with the prospect of such happy marriages before them, for she hadn't lost hope in Eleanor's attachment to Edward Ferrars either, in spite of the fact that they had heard nothing from him since their arrival in Devonshire. Only Eleanor had any reservations. She felt that the friendship was developing too fast, and that her sister was behaving rather immodestly. Willoughby and Marianne were now inseparable. He attended all the parties and excursions to which the Dashwood girls were invited, and was always at Marianne's side. Even in company, the two had eyes only for each other, and were always so deep in intimate conversation that other people hesitated to approach them. Eleanor also felt that her sister's reasons for liking the young man so much were rather superficial ones. True, they had much in common in their taste for poetry, music, and landscape, and Willoughby was certainly lively and amusing company. But his remarks often made fun of other people, and he seemed to think more about making a sensation and being the centre of attention than about how much his comments might hurt or offend others present. Around the same time, Eleanor began to notice Colonel Brandon's feelings for Marianne. At first, she had not believed Mrs. Jennings' gossip, but now, just as the others were beginning to forget their jokes about the Colonel and turn instead to Marianne's new admirer, she began to observe the way he looked at her sister and saw a sadness in his face which revealed his feelings. Perhaps she pitied and respected him more because he was ridiculed by Marianne and Willoughby, who made fun of his age and his reserved manner. Eleanor defended him when she could, underlining his kindness, consideration, and good sense. But Willoughby was scathing in his reply.
"He is just the sort of man,"
he said,
"whom everybody speaks well of, but nobody cares about."
That is exactly what I think of him,
cried Marianne, immediately agreeing with her hero.
That man has no spirit and no feelings at all.
Chapter 4. Disappointments. That week, Sir John proposed a picnic to Whitwell, which everyone happily agreed to. The morning before the picnic, Marianne told Eleanor she had an important piece of news to communicate. Willoughby had promised her a special present. He wanted to give her a horse. Eleanor was startled at the impropriety of him giving so expensive and personal a present to her sister. However, she tried to be tactful in her objections, because she didn't want to offend Marianne. She pointed out that as they had no stable at the cottage and no servant to look after the animal, and it would generate a lot of extra expense for their mother which she could not afford, better then to refuse Willoughby's kind gift. Marianne was disappointed, but eventually agreed that her sister was right. That evening she thanked Willoughby, but told him that she could not accept his generous present.
"Never mind, Marianne. It is still yours,"
he replied in a low voice and with a meaningful look.
"I will just have to keep it for you for a little longer."
After dinner, the two sat whispering together. Margaret saw Willoughby ask Marianne something. She nodded, gave him her sewing scissors, and he carefully cut off a lock of her dark hair, which he kissed and put into his wallet. On seeing this, Eleanor was convinced that her sister and Mr. Willoughby must be secretly engaged. Surely such extravagant behaviour could only mean that. But why did they not openly announce their betrothal and free her sister from the compromising position this secrecy was causing? Disappointing news came from Barton Park the next morning. Their excursion to Whitwell had had to be cancelled because Colonel Brandon, who was to be their guide, had received a letter and had then suddenly gone away on urgent business. The gossipy Mrs. Jennings was extremely curious to find out what this secret business was, and in conversation with Eleanor revealed what she knew about his private life. It seemed that the Colonel was guardian to a young lady called Miss Williams, who many believed was in fact his natural daughter. Mrs. Jennings was convinced that Colonel Brandon's sudden departure was connected to this fact. The most disappointed of all to hear that the picnic would not now take place were Marianne and Willoughby. They had been looking forward to riding together to Whitwell, while the others went by carriage, and now they would not have the chance to be alone. They blamed Colonel Brandon, most unfairly, for his selfishness, and Willoughby insisted that he take Marianne out riding nevertheless. They stayed out all morning, and in answer to Mrs. Jennings' questioning later that afternoon, Marianne finally revealed that he had taken her to see Allenham, the estate he was going to inherit. Elinor was shocked to think that her 16-year-old sister had gone there uninvited and unchaperoned, and reprimanded her about it. But the imprudent Marianne was defiant, and replied that she had had the most enjoyable morning of her life. More serious disappointments than the cancellation of the picnic were in store for Elinor's impetuous sister, however. The very next day, Willoughby visited them at the cottage with an incredible piece of news. He said he must leave Devonshire at once and return to London on business. When Mrs. Dashwood, concerned for this sudden change in him, asked what type of business it was, he refused to tell them. His behaviour was very different to his usual friendly, informal manner. He was reserved and uncomfortable, and obviously in a great hurry to leave them as soon as possible. Marianne was very distressed, and her mother, seeing this, urged Willoughby to return to them as soon as he could as their guest at the cottage. Willoughby would not even promise that, however, and after another few painful minutes, during which he would not look at Marianne, he left. After he had gone, Mrs. Dashwood talked endlessly about what this strange turn of events could possibly mean, finding all the excuses for Willoughby that she could, but Elinor had less confidence in him and felt very uncomfortable indeed. Marianne said nothing, but wept continuously and would not eat or sleep. She obviously didn't know any more than the rest of them about her admirer's mysterious departure, and was miserable because of his sudden abandonment of her. Days passed, and still no letter from Willoughby arrived. Then, one day, as the girls sat in the parlour, they saw a figure on horseback approaching the house. Marianne immediately jumped up and rushed outside, convinced that it was Willoughby come back to her. But as the man came nearer, they saw that it was Edward Ferrars. Now it was Elinor who felt confused. She had not heard a word from Edward since leaving Norland, and had not known how to explain his neglect. Her heart was beating fast, but she greeted him calmly. His attitude to her seemed rather reserved after such a long separation, but she tried not to be disappointed. Marianne, on the other hand, watched him closely and compared his cool behaviour towards her sister with Willoughby's ardent affection for her. What could it mean, she wondered? Did he not love her sister after all? But to Elinor, who knew him better, he seemed to have some great weight on his mind. He was not relaxed, and their old, comfortable relationship was somehow altered. So she waited patiently to see if some time alone together would persuade him to reveal what was troubling him. Chapter 5. Lovers in Love. The Dashwood family were pleased that Edward had come to stay, and the girls soon took up their old sisterly relationship with him. Elinor, however, could not be completely happy when her friend appeared to be troubled. His attitude to herself was also confusing. Sometimes he seemed to treat her no differently to the other two sisters. Yet at other moments, a look or comment would imply that he believed there was a much deeper understanding between them. Marianne tried to give them many opportunities to be together, hoping that Edward would be encouraged to confess his feelings to her sister. But as soon as she left them alone, he would make some excuse and go out, leaving Elinor alone, embarrassed and puzzled. Every morning, Edward went out riding on his favourite horse. One day, he returned from a long ride around Barton Valley full of praise for the pretty landscape of the area. Marianne joined in his praises with enthusiasm, being, she said, a great admirer of natural beauty herself, and began to ask which places had particularly struck him, describing all the places she and Willoughby had admired. After a few minutes, however, Edward began to laugh, and begged her not to interrogate him any more, saying,
"You know I will only disappoint you, Marianne, as the reasons for my preferences are much less romantic than yours."
He was, he added, of a practical mind, and his idea of a pretty landscape was one where the woods seemed full of useful timber, the meadows were full of cows, and the village houses looked clean, and their owners well fed. Marianne's tastes, he guessed, would be more in favour of mysterious ruined towers and wild heaths. Marianne, indignant, admitted this, but challenged Edward to justify his indifference to such dramatic beauty. Seeing her sister was becoming rather angry, Eleanor interrupted them and accused them both of exaggeration. Marianne's character, she said, was of the romantic sort, which found beauty only in the wildest and most dangerous aspects of nature, while Edward's was of the rationalist type, which admired only those aspects of nature which man had tamed. She proposed an alternative view, that a measure of both attitudes was necessary to appreciate nature properly. Marianne accepted her sister's efforts at peacemaking, but privately she thought Edward was rather conservative and dull. She looked with pity at her sister. How could she have fallen in love with a man like Edward, when there were vital, passionate men in the world like Willoughby? Later that day, however, Marianne thought she had at last discovered some indication that Edward did have romantic feelings towards her sister. She noticed at tea that he was wearing a ring made from a lock of shiny brown hair, and said innocently,
"I've never noticed you wearing a ring before, Edward. Is that your sister Fanny's hair? It looks fairer than hers."
Edward blushed, looked quickly at Eleanor, then replied,
Yes, it is my sister's hair. This light makes it look a different colour, that's all.
Eleanor was convinced by his reaction that the hair was in fact hers, and was very surprised that he must have somehow acquired it secretly, as she had never given him such a token. Edward's embarrassment lasted for a long time, and he seemed strangely distracted for the rest of the day. Marianne regretted her comment, and hoped that Eleanor was not angry with her. Eleanor, however, was secretly rather pleased. She too had been waiting for some confirmation of his feelings, and now it seemed that Edward did admire her after all. He remained another week at the cottage, and they passed many pleasant days in walks, picnics, and musical evenings. Then, just when he seemed to be recovering his good humour and enjoying himself most, he suddenly said he had to leave again. Although he insisted that he did not enjoy staying at Norland and hated London, nevertheless he seemed determined to go to one or other of these places. Eleanor privately blamed this strange behaviour on his difficult relationship with his mother, and was more ready to find excuses for his abrupt departure than she had been for Willoughby's. Never having met Mrs. Ferrars, it was easy to attribute all of her son's strangeness and reserve to her influence and ambitions, and to her well-known disapproval of Eleanor herself. After he had left, Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood watched Eleanor carefully for signs of melancholy or grief, but she occupied herself completely with her drawing and sewing, and did not mention his name. Marianne thought her sister's behaviour, so exactly the opposite of her own when Willoughby had left, very unfeeling. Such self-command could surely only mean one thing, that her feelings for Edward Ferrars were not as strong as Marianne's affections for Willoughby. Eleanor, however, got through this difficult period as her own character and good sense dictated. Of course, she thought continually about Edward, turning over in her mind all he had said and done, trying to understand what he really felt. But she did not give way to hysterics or melancholy. She dealt with her sadness privately, and did not worry her family with her troubles. Gradually, they stopped watching her so closely, and when, later that week, new visitors arrived at Barton, they soon forgot their concern for Eleanor's suffering, since she didn't constantly remind them of it. Chapter 6. Secrets. When Eleanor and Marianne entered the drawing-room of Barton Park the next day, a plump, laughing lady ran towards them and began chatting animatedly, exclaiming how happy she was to meet them at last, and what fun they would have together during her stay there. This was Mrs. Palmer, Mrs. Jennings' younger daughter. She was accompanied on her visit to her sister Lady Middleton's home by her husband, a snobbish, supercilious man who found fault with everything and was always discontent. Eleanor, observing them, at first felt surprised that they had married each other, as obviously the two had nothing in common. Then she reflected wisely that this was perhaps not so very strange at all. Mr. Palmer was not the first man she knew to have married a pretty but frivolous woman, and then become sour, regretting it.
"Oh, my love!"
Mrs. Palmer was crying now.
"You must help me to persuade the Miss Dashwoods to come to town this winter with us. What fun we shall have!"
Her love did not reply, and, ignoring her completely, instead began complaining of the weather, saying that he hated to be in the country when it rained, because the landscape and the company were both so dull. Later at dinner, the girls saw more of Mr. Palmer's charm. He contradicted everybody present, was sarcastic to his wife, and rude to his mother-in-law. Mrs. Jennings, however, as good-natured as her daughter, replied, laughing,
"You can abuse me as you please, sir, but you have taken Charlotte off my hands, and now you can't give her back. So there, I have the whip hand of you."
She and her daughter laughed excessively at this. Indeed, Mrs. Palmer seemed to find the indifference, insolence, and abuse of her husband extremely diverting.
Mr. Palmer is so droll and amusing, isn't he?
She whispered confidentially to Eleanor.
He is always out of humour.
The conversation turned to common acquaintances, and Mrs. Palmer revealed that their house in Cleveland was not far from Willoughby's place. Eleanor, hoping to discover some information that could help to justify his strange behaviour to Marianne, asked if the Palmers knew him well.
"Oh, yes, extremely well,"
replied Mrs. Palmer with enthusiasm.
"Not that I've ever actually spoken to him, you know, but I have seen him sometimes in town. I know why you're asking about him, dear Eleanor,"
she continued then, smiling.
"I have heard all about it. Your sister is engaged to be married to him. Well, I'm very happy for her and admire her taste, for he is very handsome. How I shall love having her for a neighbour."
Eleanor was horrified that the news of Marianne's attachment seemed to be known by everyone, and attempted to convince Mrs. Palmer that there was no engagement. But she only laughed more, and said that Sir John and her mother had talked of nothing else in their letters, so she knew it was true. A few days later, the Palmers returned to Cleveland, and Mrs. Jennings went shopping in Exeter to console herself. While she was there, she met two relations who, Sir John, who had accompanied her, immediately invited to Barton Park, saying that their company would be delightful for Eleanor and Marianne, as they were all about the same age. The young ladies arrived soon after, and seemed, from their fashionable dress, to be smart and genteel, and from their civil manners, very polite. They said they were delighted with the house, and flattered Lady Middleton about her exquisite taste in furniture and dress. They were quick to obtain her good opinion by indulging her beloved children as much as possible, and generally trying to make themselves agreeable to everyone. Sir John told Eleanor and Marianne about his new friends, and eventually persuaded them to dine with them all at Barton Park. Eleanor was rather disappointed when she met them, however. The eldest, Miss Anne Steele, was about 30 years old, very plain, and not at all intelligent. With a vulgar lack of discretion, she talked of nothing except smart beaux, inquiring how many Marianne and Eleanor had, and wondering had there been more eligible men in Sussex than they had found in Devonshire. The younger sister, Lucy, was embarrassed by her silly sister's behaviour. She was about 22, and quite pretty, with nice manners, but she had sharp eyes and a quick, calculating mind. Marianne felt at once she had nothing at all in common with them, since they were not well educated, read very little, and had no appreciation of music, and she went to play the piano. But Eleanor tried to make up for her sister's indifference by getting to know them. She attempted to turn the conversation to more neutral topics, but the eldest Miss Steele was oblivious. She asked Marianne about a certain gallant young man she had heard was often at Barton College, and the rumours that they were secretly engaged. Marianne was mortified, and soon made an excuse to leave. Eleanor suspected Sir John of having told the Miss Steeles about Willoughby, and now began to worry that he had said something of her own attachment to Edward, for he joked about it constantly. Sure enough, after dinner she heard him whispering loudly to Anne Steele about Miss Dashwood's secret admirer, Mr. Ferrars. Eleanor was surprised by her reaction, however.
"Ferrars?"
repeated Miss Steele.
"Edward Ferrars, your sister-in-law's brother, Miss Dashwood? A very nice young man. We know him very well."
"Now, Anne,"
interrupted her sister immediately, frowning.
"don't exaggerate. We have only met him a few times at our Uncle Pratt's in Plymouth. It is too much to pretend that we know the gentleman well."
Anne blushed in confusion.
"Ah, yes, of course, Lucy,"
she said.
"We have only met him a few times."
It was obvious that she was concealing something, and Eleanor wondered what it could possibly be. But Lucy indicated to her sister to be quiet, and immediately changed the subject. The next day, however, while she was walking in the garden at Barton Park, Lucy Steele approached Eleanor and asked her if they could talk privately. Eleanor was intrigued, especially when the girl then started to ask her what she knew of Edward Ferrars's mother. What kind of woman was she? Eleanor replied truthfully that, never having met the lady, she could not really say. But Lucy was not satisfied. She hesitated and seemed to want Eleanor to persuade her to confess something. After shrewdly scrutinizing Eleanor's indifferent expression, however, she confessed unprompted, saying that she felt she must justify her strange question. She had a secret which she had kept hidden for 4 long years, and which would eventually decide her future happiness. Mrs. Ferrars would then become more to her than just a name. She would become her mother-in-law, in fact. At first, Eleanor could not think what she meant. Then, suddenly, seeing Lucy's triumphant and malicious expression, she understood. Lucy Steele was secretly engaged to her own Edward. Chapter 7. A visit to London. Since her husband's death, Mrs. Jennings had spent every winter in London at her house in Portman Square, accompanied by her younger daughter. This year, however, Charlotte could not come, and so her mother asked the 2 Dashwood girls if they would like to go with her instead. Eleanor didn't want to leave her mother alone at the cottage, and so she politely refused the invitation. But Mrs. Jennings, unperturbed, laughingly replied that she thought Marianne would not object to the proposal. In fact, on hearing it, Marianne's face lit up, and she immediately accepted, saying,
"Thank you, ma'am. It would give me much happiness to come with you."
Eleanor understood then how much her sister's longing to see Willoughby made her indifferent to everything else. Marianne did not like Mrs. Jennings very much, but her longing to see Willoughby overcame all other considerations. Mrs. Dashwood, seeing how much the visit meant to Marianne, accepted the suggestion at once, and so, in the first week of January, her daughters left with Mrs. Jennings for London. During the 3-day journey, despite her initial enthusiasm in accepting Mrs. Jennings' offer, Marianne remained closed in her own thoughts and spoke very little. Eleanor, embarrassed by her sister's rudeness, was very polite in compensation, and chatted with the old lady, laughing at her insensitive jokes. The house in Portman Square was large and comfortable, and the girls had a charming apartment for themselves there. Eleanor immediately sat down to write to her mother of their safe arrival. She noticed that Marianne, too, had fetched her pen and ink.
"You don't have to write to Mother, dear. I'm doing it,"
she told her. Marianne blushed and replied shortly,
I am not writing to Mother.
She then wrote a short note, sealed it carefully, and instructed the servant to send it immediately by the fastest 2-penny post. From her sister's evasive behaviour, Eleanor concluded that she had written to Willoughby. They must be engaged, if Marianne was writing to him already, she thought. Obviously she was expecting him to call. Later, as the maid was serving the tea, someone knocked at the door. Marianne jumped up, her face full of happy expectation, saying to Eleanor,
Oh, Eleanor, it is Willoughby. Indeed it is.
The door opened slowly, and the servant announced,
Colonel Brandon.
The disappointment was too great for Marianne, and with a sob she ran from the room without greeting their guest. Eleanor was disappointed too, but she was glad to see her old friend, and welcomed him courteously. The next days were torture for Marianne. Wherever they went, she was always watching for Willoughby, and could think of nothing else. In Bond Street, while they were shopping, she looked continually around, paying no attention to the goods, and when they returned home later in the morning, she ran upstairs as fast as possible to see if any reply to her letter had arrived. Colonel Brandon visited them almost every day. Marianne made little attempt at conversation with him, often making excuses to go up to her room alone. He noticed her agitation, and soon guessed the cause. He too seemed worried and uneasy, and Eleanor felt he had something to say, but could not find the right opportunity. About a week after their arrival, they found out for certain that Willoughby was also in town. When they returned home late one morning, his visiting card was on the table. Marianne was frantic that he had called while they were out, but she was confident he would return again. As the hours passed, however, she became more and more impatient. When a letter was delivered by hand in the afternoon, and she saw it was addressed to Mrs. Jennings, she cried suddenly,
Oh, how annoying!
Are you expecting a letter then?
asked Eleanor gently.
Yes, a little. Not much.
Replied Marianne, confused.
Have you no confidence in me, Marianne? You don't tell me anything.
Eleanor reproached her.
Eleanor, what a thing to say!
Replied her sister indignantly.
When have you ever confided anything to me?
But Marianne,
Said Eleanor, surprised.
I have nothing to tell.
Then our situations are the same, because I have nothing to tell either.
Sobbed Marianne, and left the room. Sir John and Lady Middleton had now arrived at their house in Conduit Street, and were organising a party for the next evening. They sent an invitation to Mrs. Jennings and the girls to join them. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer were present at the dance, and about 20 other young people the sisters knew vaguely. Marianne glanced around once to see if Willoughby was there, and, finding that he was not, then sat silent in a corner and would not dance with anyone. Mrs. Jennings began teasing her about her long face.
Aye, aye,
she said.
We all know why you're looking so miserable, my dear. Well, it is a shame he didn't come, especially when we invited him for you.
He was invited?
Cried Marianne.
Why, certainly he was. Sir John met him in...
She understood that there was a very strong mutual affection between her sister and Mr. Willoughby. At this, Colonel Brandon looked sadder than ever.
Well, I hope your sister will be happy. About Willoughby, I can only say that I hope one day he will deserve her,
he said. Chapter 8. Meeting Willoughby. 3 days later, the girls were invited to a ball given by a fashionable London hostess. Marianne had still heard nothing from Willoughby and was becoming more desperate every day. She prepared for the evening without enthusiasm, not caring which dress she wore or how she looked. Her face was thin and pale. Her usual healthy glow had disappeared. There were many fashionable, elegant people at the ball, and the rooms were richly furnished with works of art, chandeliers, and flowers everywhere. The girls sat near the card tables, observing the other guests. Neither of them wanted to dance. A little later, Eleanor noticed with a shock that Willoughby was standing near them, talking to a well-dressed young lady. Eleanor turned to Marianne and saw that she had also seen him.
Good heavens! It's him! He's here! But why does he not come to speak to me?
She cried, half rising from her chair.
Please, Marianne, sit down. Everybody is looking at you,
replied Eleanor. But when Willoughby turned in their direction, Marianne got up impulsively, calling his name in an affectionate tone, and held out her hand. He was obliged to speak to them, but addressed himself to Eleanor rather than Marianne, asking her formally how long they had been in town. Eleanor was speechless at his cold behaviour, but Marianne blushed deeply and demanded,
Good God, Willoughby! What is the meaning of this? Haven't you received my letters? Didn't you know I was in London? Won't you even shake hands with me?
Now it was Willoughby's turn to blush. He looked very uncomfortable as he shook her hand. Then, seeing his fashionable lady companion signalling to him from across the room, he composed himself again and replied coolly that, yes, he remembered having heard something about their arrival. He then said good evening and returned to his elegant friend. Marianne fell back in her chair, her face white. Eleanor was afraid that she was going to faint and tried to screen her from the curious eyes of the other guests while she gave her some lavender water. She begged Mrs. Jennings that they should leave, saying that Marianne suddenly felt unwell. The old lady agreed, and they left at once. At dawn the next morning, Marianne was kneeling by the window in their bedroom, writing a letter by the grey light of the winter morning and crying inconsolably. Eleanor sat up in bed and asked her what she was doing.
Ask nothing, Helena, for you will soon know everything,
was the ominous reply. At breakfast, Marianne ate nothing and did not speak. The servant came in with a letter for her. She opened it eagerly, read its contents, turned pale, and ran out of the room. Mrs. Jennings saw from the envelope that it was a letter from Willoughby, and laughed at these young people in love.
My goodness, I never saw a girl so besotted.
She smiled.
I hope he won't make her wait much longer. She's beginning to look quite ill with all this emotion. When are they to be married, my dear?
Eleanor repeated that as far as she knew, there was no engagement between the two. But Mrs. Jennings was not convinced.
How can you say that, Eleanor? We all saw that they were head over heels in love at Barton this summer. Didn't I see them together every day in Devonshire with eyes only for each other? And I'm sure Marianne only agreed to come to London so that she could buy her wedding clothes.
Eleanor denied it all, but Mrs. Jennings only laughed more. So in the end, she gave up and went to see how her sister was. She found Marianne crying on the floor of their sitting room, a letter in her lap and 3 others lying near her. Marianne gave all the letters to Eleanor, then covered her face with her hands and leaned her head on the sofa. The first letter was from Willoughby. It said,
My dear madam, my respect for your family has always been very sincere. But if there has been anything in my behaviour which has caused them to believe my affection was more particular than I intended, then I regret that behaviour and should have been more cautious. The possibility that I could have intended anything more is, you must admit, impossible, given that my affections have for a long time been engaged elsewhere, and that I hope in a few weeks to be married. I am therefore returning your letters and the lock of hair which you once kindly gave me. Your most obedient servant, John Willoughby.
Eleanor was shocked at the cruelty of the letter. That Willoughby would now not even admit that any special relationship or understanding had existed between them, she felt was very ungentlemanly behaviour indeed. To comfort her sister, she said,
It is better that you've discovered his true character now, Marianne, and not later. It would have been much worse if your engagement had gone on for months, and then this had happened.
Engagement? But there was no engagement, Eleanor.
sobbed Marianne.
But you told me. He said that he loved you. I thought...
Yes. No. Oh, I don't know. He implied it every day in 1,000 different ways, but he never declared it exactly.
But you wrote to him.
Yes, but could that be wrong after all what had passed between us, Eleanor? I believed he was sincere,
replied the miserable girl.
I felt that I was engaged to him, just as if we had exchanged the most solemn legal vows. I thought that he felt the same.
Apparently not,
said Eleanor dryly.
But he did at first. I am sure of it. Remember his distress when he had to leave Barton. He begged me for a lock of my hair. And his look and manner towards me. There was real feeling there. Something happened later to make him change. That woman he was with at the ball, she has turned him against me.
Eleanor saw that Marianne was searching for a scapegoat and did not reply.
I must go home, Eleanor. I cannot bear to stay here now,
continued her sister.
Can you ask Mrs. Jennings to let us go back to Barton tomorrow?
It would be impossible tomorrow, and we owe Mrs. Jennings more courtesy than that. She has been very kind to us. Try to sleep now, and I will write to Mother and ask what she thinks we should do,
replied Eleanor, privately longing for the peace of the cottage herself. Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. So Eleanor told Mrs. Jennings everything.
Now I understand why the poor girl looks so bad,
said the old lady.
And unfortunately, my dear, it seems it is true. The scoundrel is to be married to a rich heiress, a Miss Grey. I heard of it today in town. I think he has treated your sister abominably.
This lady,
asked Eleanor,
is she rich?
Oh, yes, my dear, very. She has at least £50,000 a year. Did you not see her at the ball? A smart, stylish girl, but not pretty. But then, where there is money on one side and need for it on the other, these things happen. They say he is in debt, but I say he had no right to make love to an innocent young girl like your sister, than to run off to find a richer one to solve his problems. Why didn't he sell his horses, sack some of his servants, and try to economize, to resolve his finances? No, he would not give up his selfish pleasures.
And what about Miss Grey's character? Is she amiable?
asked Eleanor.
Not very amiable, I have heard,
replied Mrs. Jennings.
Well, I hope she will make him miserable. That is what he deserves.
Colonel Brandon arrived in the afternoon. He too had heard the news and had come to inquire after Marianne.
She is very upset,
Eleanor told him.
but she still prefers to believe that it was Miss Grey who convinced Willoughby to abandon her. She refuses to accept that his character could be so bad.
Colonel Brandon said nothing at first. Then slowly he began to talk.
Miss Dashwood, there is something which I feel I must tell you. Something which may help you to understand what sort of man Willoughby really is,
he said.
I hardly know where to begin. First, I must tell you something of my own sad history.
Please, go on, Colonel,
replied Eleanor, intrigued.
You may remember, some time ago, I mentioned a young lady who I was attached to in my youth. I said she resembled your sister.
Yes, I do remember.
This lady was an orphan who was educated by my father, her guardian. We grew up together, and I cannot remember a time when I did not love her. When she was 17, however, it was decided that she should marry my brother. She was rich, and our family's estate needed capital. We were both heartbroken and decided to elope to Scotland, but at the last moment we were betrayed by her servant. My father was furious and banished me abroad until she was safely married. My brother was not a good man, Miss Dashwood, and he did not love her, but like many women she had no choice but to do as her family dictated. I came home, hoping that if I were near her, I could help her to bear the unhappy situation, but my brother was cruel to her, and she was very miserable. I couldn't help her, and eventually I went abroad again. Some time later, I heard that my brother had decided to divorce her. She had been seduced by a young nobleman and had fallen in love with him. When he later abandoned her, she was desperate and ran away. No one knew where she had gone. I came back to England to try and find her, but it took many years. Finally, I discovered her in a debtor's prison. She was very ill with tuberculosis and had no money. I took her to a safe place and did what I could to make her last months comfortable. She died soon after.
I am so sorry,
said Eleanor with tears in her eyes.
She asked me one thing before she died, that I should take care of her only child, the illegitimate daughter of her affair. Although I knew nothing about children and was not married myself, I accepted. I have looked after the girl ever since. People believe she is my own daughter, but now you know the truth.
He paused for a moment, then went on.
All this happened many years ago. Until recently the child, Eliza, was at boarding school. But last spring, just before her 17th birthday, she asked me if she could go to Bath with the family of her school friend. I agreed. The family seemed respectable, and she went there for a month. Then suddenly she disappeared. We searched for her everywhere, but she could not be found. I did find out, however, that she'd often been seen there with a certain young man.
Not Willoughby,
cried Eleanor suddenly.
I'm afraid so. I kept searching, but 8 long months passed before I received any communication from her. It was in October. You remember we were all at Barton Park together, when I had to leave unexpectedly. Mr. Willoughby was most displeased that I had broken up our happy party. If only he had known the reason. Eliza was alone, and heartbroken when I found her. He had abandoned her. At present she is in the country, awaiting the birth of her child.
Eleanor repeated Colonel Brandon's story later to Marianne, as gently as possible. Her sister seemed to believe it, but now she was more miserable than before. She felt the loss of Willoughby's character more than the loss of his affection for herself. The idea that she had fallen in love with such a callous man was unbearable for her. A letter arrived from their mother. Mrs. Dashwood felt that returning to Barton would be worse for Marianne. There were so many places and things there which would remind her of Willoughby, and at this time of year there was very little entertainment in the country to distract her. She recommended that the girls stay in London. Their brother John and his wife would soon be arriving too, and she thought it correct that they should wait to see them, since, despite the coldness between them, they were still family. So the girls remained. 2 weeks after Marianne had received Willoughby's last letter, Eleanor heard that he was married and had gone to his estate in Somerset with his new wife. Marianne heard the news in silence and seemed calm. Eleanor was relieved that there was now no danger of meeting him when they went out. About the same time, the Miss Steeles came up to London. They were staying at their cousin's house in Holborn, but lost no time in presenting themselves at the Middletons in Conduit Street and at Mrs. Jennings' house in Portman Square. Eleanor was not pleased to see Lucy. Her sly confidences about her engagement to Edward upset her, but she tried to seem indifferent and not let the vindictive Lucy see how much they had hurt her. Chapter 10. Lucy's Triumph. John Dashwood came to call on his sisters at Portman Square. He brought an excuse from his wife, who, he said, was too busy to accompany him, and would see them another time. John himself, however, had been so curious to meet Mrs. Jennings, who he had heard was very rich and disposed to be generous to his sisters, that he had come right away. He secretly hoped the old lady might leave them a legacy, and free him of any further obligation to give them money. He was therefore extremely courteous to their hostess. Colonel Brandon called at his usual hour while Mr. Dashwood was there, and was soon deep in conversation with Eleanor. Her brother noticed their intimacy, and afterwards asked about the gentleman. Was he a man of fortune? Where was his estate? Eleanor told him what she knew, that he was a gentleman with a good property in Devonshire, and an income of about 2,000 a year. Her brother was pleased, and told Eleanor he was certain the Colonel was very interested in her, and would surely propose soon. Eleanor, amused, denied that her friend had any romantic intentions, but her brother was not convinced.
With a little strategy on your part, Eleanor, you can have him. And on 2,000 a year, you can live quite comfortably. It would be an excellent match for you, and I know that Fanny and Mrs. Ferrars would be most pleased. They're very keen to see you married,
he said.
How kind of them,
replied Eleanor dryly, knowing very well that their concern came from their fear of her stealing Edward instead.
Imagine if my sister and Fanny's brother married at the same time. What a coincidence,
he added.
Fanny's brother? Is Edward to be married then?
His mother is presently negotiating an excellent match for him with a distinguished young lady, the Honourable Miss Morton, daughter of Lord Morton, with a fortune of 30,000 a year. A very desirable connection, you must agree.
Eleanor said nothing. What would Lucy say about this latest development, she wondered. The next week, John and Fanny decided to give a dinner in order to meet the Middletons. Eleanor and Marianne were invited, and also Colonel Brandon and Mrs. Jennings. Edward's mother, Mrs. Ferrars, was also present that evening, and Lucy and Anne Steele, who had ingratiated themselves with Fanny and Lady Middleton, so that they too could attend the party. Eleanor was worried that Edward might be there, but Lucy soon whispered that he was not coming. He could not hide his affection for herself in front of his family, she confided smugly, and so would not come. Eleanor was relieved he was not there. She did not want to meet him again in such circumstances. She did not tell Lucy that he had already called twice at Portman Square to see her since he had arrived, but that she had been out. Edward's mother, Mrs. Ferrars, was a thin, formal woman with a sallow complexion and a sour expression. She was very proud and hardly spoke to anyone. To Eleanor she did not speak at all. She was determined to dislike this girl who had threatened her ambitious plans for her eldest son. Eleanor pretended not to notice her rudeness, and ignored the insults directed at her by both Fanny and her mother. She was amused by their sweetness to the flattering Lucy. Obviously, they were exaggerating a little to make her feel worse in comparison. If only Mrs. Ferrars knew the truth, she thought. Eleanor's curiosity about Edward's mother was now satisfied. She realized that such a woman would have made a marriage between them very difficult, and did not envy Lucy's situation. The next afternoon, Lucy came to visit Eleanor. She chatted about this and that, but the real motive of her visit was soon obvious. She had come to gloat over Mrs. Ferrars' kindness to herself and rudeness to Eleanor. As they were talking, the servant entered and announced Mr. Edward Ferrars. A second later, Edward was in the room. It was a most embarrassing moment. He was obviously very uncomfortable at seeing Lucy there, and she was immediately suspicious of his visit to her rival. Only Eleanor was composed enough to keep up the small talk, but even she, after a while, couldn't bear the tension, and went to find Marianne. Marianne rushed into the room with her usual impulsiveness, ignorant of all the undercurrents and intrigues between the group before her. She was genuinely happy to see Edward, whom she considered her brother already, and delighted for the happiness she thought Eleanor must feel at his visit. She hoped that Lucy would now leave, so that her sister and Edward could be alone together. But Lucy, silent and scheming, her little eyes missing nothing, was determined to stay there all night if necessary to prevent such a possibility. To Marianne's surprise, after a few torturous minutes more, it was Edward who suddenly got up, made an excuse, and left. Still more trouble was looming on the horizon for Edward. It seemed that Mrs. Jennings' friend, Dr. Donovan, had been called to examine Fanny Dashwood, who was suffering from a fit of acute hysterics. Lucy's stupid and thoughtless sister, Anne, seeing how well Fanny and her mother treated Lucy, and convinced that their affection for her was real, had indiscreetly revealed her sister's engagement to Edward. Now all was chaos and outrage in the Ferrars family. Lucy was immediately asked to leave the Dashwoods' house, where she had been staying for a few days at Fanny's invitation, and now everyone refused to talk to her. Mrs. Ferrars, on hearing the news, had flown into a rage and had disowned Edward completely, disinheriting him of all her wealth and giving all the land and money to his younger brother Robert instead. Edward was now almost penniless and, having no professional training, was without even the prospect of a job to earn his living. He had nevertheless insisted he must do his duty and honour his commitment to Lucy, if she still wanted him now that he was poor. Lucy had replied that she would wait for him forever if necessary, and so Edward had decided to enter Oxford University to study, to become a clergyman. What a drama! Mrs. Jennings was quite exhausted with it all, and disgusted at the behaviour of Edward's mother. After all, she said, Lucy was a sensible girl, if poor, and could probably manage a small household on a very small income. What sort of mother could disown her own son in such an unfeeling manner? Chapter 11. Unexpected Events. Elinor now had the painful job of relating the whole story to Marianne, and admitting that she had known it since Lucy's confession to her 4 months before. She knew that Marianne would be very shocked at Edward's deception, and, not knowing him as well as Elinor did, would imagine him to be another Willoughby. Marianne was indeed horrified by the story, but more than anything, she felt sorry for her poor sister. How could Elinor have borne it, she wondered. She felt most indignant at the behaviour of the sly Lucy in confiding her secret to Elinor while knowing that she was fond of Edward. Marianne felt very guilty that she hadn't noticed anything was wrong. She had been so lost in her own misery over Willoughby that she had depended on Elinor to comfort her, when her sister's pain must have been just as bad. As she confided her feelings to her sister, for the first time Elinor was able to unburden herself of all her misery, and she felt relieved. She also managed to persuade Marianne that the best course of action now was to rise above the situation and behave with dignity. No one should know how much she was suffering. Her only consolation in the affair was that at least Edward and Lucy could not be married for a very long time. Years would pass before he would graduate and then find a position as a curate. But fate had ironically decided that Elinor should play a role in resolving this situation too. Her trusted friend, Colonel Brandon, who was indignant on hearing of Mrs. Ferrars' treatment of her son and wanting to help a friend of Elinor's, informed her that the post of curate at Delaford on his estate had recently become vacant. He would like to help by offering it to Edward. Knowing nothing of Elinor's romantic attachment, he asked her if she would act as messenger and propose the job to Edward. So it happened that Elinor herself was the one who solved Edward and Lucy's dilemma. Her last meeting with her former lover was very painful. Both of them were extremely upset when she told him of the Colonel's kind offer. They both realized that now there was no way out for Edward. He would have to pay for the foolish mistake of his youth and marry a woman he had tied himself to in a moment of weakness, whom they both knew he did not love. Their own chance of happiness seemed gone forever. Their last goodbye was almost unbearably sad. After all these intrigues, Mrs. Jennings declared that she was exhausted, and told the girls that she was tired of London and wanted to return to the quiet of her country house in Cleveland, Somerset. She was very keen that they should go with her. She now depended on Elinor's cheerful company, and was also very fond of Marianne. Marianne did not want to go, for she knew that Cleveland was only 30 miles from Willoughby's estate, where he was now staying with his new wife. Elinor, however, felt that they should go. Mrs. Jennings had been very good to them during all their troubles in London, and she felt obliged to accompany the old lady to her home and see her comfortably settled there. And, she reminded her sister, Cleveland was only 80 miles from Barton and their own dear mother and little sister. After staying with Mrs. Jennings for a short visit, they could then return home by a quicker route to Barton Cottage. Cleveland was a large modern house in a sunny position. It had no park, but the gardens were extensive, with many pleasant walks. Marianne felt very emotional when they arrived, knowing that they were only a few miles from Willoughby's estate, and spent much of her time wandering alone in the gardens, consoling herself with the beauty of the spring landscape, while Elinor attended to Mrs. Jennings and wrote letters home. After a few days, however, the weather changed, and during one of her solitary excursions, Marianne was drenched in the sudden rain. Preoccupied with her sad memories, she was careless about her health, and soon her slight cold worsened into severe influenza. Elinor insisted that Marianne stay in bed, and hoped that by the day after she would be better. But during the night she developed a high fever, and by morning she was delirious. The doctor arrived, but did not offer Elinor much comfort. Her sister's condition was serious, and the more medicines he tried, the worse she became. Elinor was very worried, especially when Marianne began to shout wildly for her mother and to rave incoherently. She consulted Colonel Brandon, who was waiting anxiously downstairs for news of the patient, and they both decided that her mother should be sent for. The colonel immediately offered himself as the messenger who should fetch Mrs. Dashwood, and began to make the necessary preparations quickly and efficiently. Elinor felt extremely relieved to have such a practical and sensible friend in her time of need. If all went well, her mother would be there by 10 o'clock that night, and Elinor would not have to bear the terrible responsibility of her sister's condition alone. Marianne's condition did not improve, and the doctor was very worried. Her life was now hanging in the balance. The fever was extremely high. Elinor was desperate, and sat by her sister's bed every minute, watching anxiously for some sign of improvement. In the early afternoon, the more she watched her, the more she began to think that Marianne was breathing more regularly, and that she was not so hot. After another hour, she was certain there was some improvement, and called Mrs. Jennings. The old lady agreed that Marianne seemed slightly better, and they called the doctor again. By the time he arrived, Marianne was no longer flushed, and her skin was cool. She opened her eyes and, though very weak, recognized her sister, and smiled. The worst of the danger was past. There was now hope that she would recover. Elinor was still too agitated to sleep, but she went downstairs and sat in the drawing-room, exhausted, thanking God that their ordeal was over. Around 8 o'clock she heard horses approaching, and then the bell rang. Surely her mother and Colonel Brandon could not be here already. At that moment the servant entered and announced, "Willoughby." Chapter 12. A Confession. Elinor was not pleased to see the man who had made her sister so miserable and had indirectly caused her terrible illness. She had no desire to talk to him. Willoughby, however, begged her to listen to what he had to say. He had ridden all the way from London in the rain, when he had heard of Marianne's illness. The servant had told him she was now out of danger, and he begged Elinor to confirm that it was true. Elinor confirmed that she seemed better, and Willoughby sighed with relief. Then he said he had come to talk to Elinor about what had happened between himself and Marianne. She was curious, and hoped that there might be some comfort for Marianne in his explanation, so she agreed to listen to it. When he had first met her family at Barton, he admitted, he had only wanted to pass some time with them to relieve the boredom of his visit to his old aunt at Allenham. Almost immediately he had been charmed by Marianne's beauty and intelligence, and began to find himself much more interested in this young girl than he had intended. At first he was amused by her obvious infatuation with him. Here Elinor blushed. But then he started to appreciate what a remarkable and lovely girl she was. Before long he was captivated by her, and had entered into a charming, innocent flirtation without thinking of the consequences. He had known from the beginning that he could not marry Marianne if he wanted to keep his estate. His debts were large, and he urgently needed money to pay them. But he chose to ignore the facts and enjoy himself playing the romantic hero, allowing the relationship to develop for his own gratification.
But you were fond of my sister, Mr. Willoughby, were you not?
Asked Elinor severely.
How could I have resisted such attractions, Miss Dashwood? Such tenderness. The happiest hours of my life were those I spent with her. The more time I was with her, the more I felt I wanted to act honourably and ask her to marry me. But a part of me resisted the idea, knowing it would mean the end of all my worldly ambitions.
Willoughby confessed that the same night he had begged Marianne for a lock of her hair, he had decided to ask her to marry him. However, when he got home, something happened which changed his mind and altered the course of both their lives forever. News of his affair with a certain person, here he blushed deeply, and Eleanor realized he was talking about Eliza, Colonel Brandon's adopted daughter, had reached his aunt at Allenham. That virtuous lady was so deeply shocked that she had decided to disinherit him. His only way out, she said, was if he would marry the unfortunate girl, Eliza. He refused. He knew he had no feelings for Eliza, and he was angry at his aunt's treatment of him. And she sent him away from Allenham forever. He came to Barton for one last visit before he fled to London, but of course was too ashamed to tell Marianne the reason for his sudden departure. He declared that he had been heartbroken to leave, but as soon as he was away from Marianne's good influence, he quickly reverted to his extravagant, frivolous lifestyle. The idea of having no money began to terrify him. He convinced himself that their relationship had only been a flirtation, and that she was young enough to forget him quickly. He threw himself into the season of parties and entertainments, and soon found a rich heiress to court who could put an end to his financial worries. He paused for a moment, and Eleanor privately reflected that, if her sister had married such a selfish man with such weak morals and in such difficult financial circumstances, it would surely have ended in misery. To Willoughby, however, she said,
"And that cruel, unpardonable letter that you sent to my sister in London? How do you explain that, Mr. Willoughby?"
Willoughby laughed bitterly.
Yes, the letter. Did you like my wife's work?
He asked with irony.
I thought I had forgotten Marianne after many months in London. But when I received her letter, assuring me that I was as dear to her as ever, I realized what a scoundrel I had been, and that I still loved her. But it was too late. My engagement to Miss Grey had just been finalized. All I could do was try to avoid seeing Marianne. I could not bear to face her and see her pain when I confessed I intended to marry another. If you can pity me at all, Miss Dashwood, think how I felt then. With my head and heart full of one woman, I had to pretend to be in love with another. At that ball where we met accidentally, I stood between the two of them, Marianne looking so beautiful and innocent and tragic, and Sophie, my wife-to-be, as jealous and spiteful as a cat.
"But the letter, Mr. Willoughby, what about that?"
interrupted Eleanor.
Yes. When my letters were brought the next morning, Sophie was visiting me. Seeing the feminine handwriting on the envelope of Marianne's letter, she opened it and read it all. She was furious. She demanded that I cut all connections with this rival, and dictated my reply. She said that if I did not do it, she would end our engagement. I relied completely on her money to help me out of my debts. I was forced to give up Marianne, and also all her letters to me, even the precious lock of her hair. I had no choice.
He looked at Eleanor with dark eyes full of self-pity.
"You are wrong to say that you had no choice, Willoughby. The initial choice to abandon my sister was entirely yours, and you had already made it. Please do not speak so bitterly of your wife. She has some claim to your respect and affection. To speak badly of her will not console Marianne,"
said Eleanor dryly.
Do not feel sorry for my wife. She does not deserve it. She knew I did not love her when she accepted me,
replied Willoughby impatiently.
But have I explained my conduct at least a little? Will you tell your sister what I have said, and assure her that, despite my unpardonable behavior, I have never stopped loving her in my heart?
"I understand you better now than I did before, and I will tell Marianne all you have said. I pity your suffering now, but I don't think there is any excuse for the misery you have caused her,"
replied Eleanor firmly.
Be assured that my life is quite as miserable now as you could wish, Miss Dashwood. I have got all I deserved in the wife I chose, and my domestic life is all rancour and boredom. Goodbye, Miss Dashwood, and thank you. Will you at least shake hands with me?
Eleanor did so, then asked the servant to accompany him to the door. When he had gone, she sat alone for a while, exhausted by all that had passed, until at last she heard a carriage approaching, and knew that her mother had come. Mrs. Dashwood had feared the worst during her journey, and was relieved to learn that Marianne was better. After she had assured herself that the patient was comfortable, she and Eleanor sat for a long time talking. Her mother told her that Colonel Barton, as worried as he was for Marianne, had confessed his affection for her to her mother. Mrs. Dashwood was surprised, but pleased. Colonel Brandon was a sincere and honourable man, and his quietness and good sense were positive points after her daughter's unhappy experience with the false Willoughby. She hoped that in time Marianne could become fond of their dear friend. For now she had told him that she would do her best to promote the idea when Marianne recovered. She could not promise more. Marianne was young and strong, and recovered quickly from her illness among her loving family. Eleanor had been very apprehensive about their return to Barton, thinking that her sister would break down with so many things to remind her of Willoughby there. But Marianne showed remarkable self-control, and after a few tears, resolved to put the past behind her. One day she confessed to Eleanor that the one thing which would really help her to forgive and forget the past was the knowledge that Willoughby had not been completely insincere, that she had not been absolutely deceived by his character. If she could believe he had loved her a little, it would comfort her. So Eleanor told her of Willoughby's visit during her illness. She listened in silence. Afterwards, she hugged her sister and said that she was sorry for her behaviour and the distress that she had caused her family. She had learned a hard lesson, but she hoped she had become wiser after it. A few days later, their servant told them a piece of startling news. Mr. Ferrars was married. He had seen him in town with Miss Steele, who had informed him that her name was now Mrs. Ferrars. Marianne and her mother were not prepared for the violence of Eleanor's reaction. She became deathly pale and could not speak. Of course, she knew that Edward and Lucy were to be married eventually, but she had always secretly hoped something would happen to prevent it. She was devastated. Eleanor spent the rest of the day trying to imagine her life without the hope of Edward in it. As she walked back to the cottage later, she saw a figure on a horse approaching. Could it be Colonel Brandon? Perhaps he could explain the suddenness of Edward's marriage. How had he managed to start the job at Delaford so soon? He had not even graduated yet. As the man approached, however, she saw it was not the Colonel, but Edward himself. With a great effort, Eleanor politely asked where Mrs. Ferrars was. Edward, puzzled, replied that his mother was in London, and told her that he had come with some news. Lucy Steele had married his brother, Robert. By that same evening, Edward was the happiest man in the country. He had been saved from marriage to Lucy without hurting anyone's feelings, and now he had won the bride that he really wanted, Eleanor. He had talked frankly to her about his unhappy engagement to Lucy, and how much he had regretted it, and she was satisfied that his love for herself was something much stronger and more mature. The subject which intrigued them all at the cottage that night was how the strange union between Lucy and Robert Ferrars had come about. Edward could only suppose that Lucy's flattery had somehow found its match in Robert's love of being flattered. He had had no idea that they had been meeting or corresponding, but he was too relieved to think much about Lucy's deception of himself in the affair. As for Mrs. Ferrars, everyone felt that she deserved the shock which Robert's disobedience, coming so soon after the scandal with Edward, had caused her. Eleanor and Edward were married the next year, and moved to the parsonage at Delaford. Her mother and sisters often visited her cosy new home, and soon Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor were pleased to observe a growing attachment between Marianne and Colonel Brandon. So Marianne, having expected to live the rest of her life without ever falling in love again, soon found herself the wife of the Colonel and the lady of the manor. Not being a girl who could love by halves, she became as devoted to her husband as she had once been to Willoughby. Her family were delighted to see how his influence on her calmed and steadied her, while hers on him cheered his spirit and helped him to forget the ghosts of his past. Willoughby continued to live with his shrewish wife, but found some consolation for his unhappy marriage in hunting and riding. He never forgot Marianne. Hearing of her marriage to Colonel Brandon was one of the hardest things he ever had to face in his selfish life, and always secretly considered her his ideal of young womanhood. Mrs. Ferrars eventually forgave Edward and accepted Eleanor as her daughter-in-law with as much grace as she could. Lucy also managed to procure a pardon for herself and Robert by the simple strategy of continuing humbly to beg for it. Eleanor and Edward lived the rest of their lives in happy affection, near their dear friends and relations, the Brandons,